If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. Hikers, hunters, and campers. What is the creepiest or weirdest thing you've ever experienced on the trails, forests, deep woods, etc.? I was solo hiking in the Colorado high country once. It wasn't a 14er, but it wasn't a walk up a molehill either. It was quite the perfect day to hike up, midsummer, sunshine, no clouds in the sky, and plenty of birds in the trees. After making it to the summit and walking back down, however, I was following the trail when the entire ambience of the forest just stopped. Everything grew dead silent. No birds in the trees, no passing wind, just a dead, stark silence. I took notice of it right away but continued. But as I walked on, I kept getting that feeling that something was watching me. Nothing happened, and I thankfully didn't run into anything, but that feeling of being watched followed me all the way back down the mountain. That sound of pure silence still gives me the creeps. I've been hiking all my life, and I've never heard a forest turn quiet so quickly. When I was younger, about 35 years ago, I used to hike a lot in the local forest preserves. I would usually bicycle in and walk a few miles further on the smaller trails. One day I came across an abandoned house, but it was in such bad shape that I wouldn't dare go in. I walked around it and found the old cellar stairs. It was early afternoon, but only the first few stairs were visible, the rest were pitch black, and there was a chilly draft coming out of the hole. I pondered going down just a couple of steps but decided against it, so I threw a couple of rocks down there and never heard them hit anything. I noped out of there but wanted to come back with a flashlight, but even after searching, I never found that spot again. I went camping on top of the mountain one time. In the middle of the night, we were forced to break camp and hike down the mountain in the dark. So many things about this were not ideal and were probably dangerous, but we did what we had to do. So we packed up and headed down the mountain in the dark. We had flashlights, but they only helped so much. It was cloudy, so there was no moonlight either. But the trail was well defined, so we weren't worried about getting lost. Parts of the mountain are really steep and narrow, so the National Park Service kindly built a few sets of stairs into the mountain in those extra tight spots. On either side of each was a cliff. So the only way up and down the mountain was over these two staircases. One was about halfway up, and the other was about 3/4 up. So I'm in the dark on the way down. We didn't really have a way to judge distance on the mountain except by those stairs. So we knew that when we came to the second set, we would be roughly halfway. Only we never cross any stairs. At all. I spent the whole time down the mountain thinking any minute now I'd come across them, but no. Not a single solitary stair. It's not possible that I missed them, went around them, or did any of that. There's one way up and one way down, and somehow we made it all the way from the top to the car without seeing a single stair. I have no idea how, but it was really unsettling. We both noticed it, but neither of us mentioned it until we were halfway home because we were too freaked out by the whole thing. A buddy and I were fishing a river really deep in the mountains of British Columbia. We were roughly 40 kilometers of trail deep, which only a serious off-road vehicle can navigate. We separated for some time as we each searched for hot spots to fish. Someone started throwing rocks from the thick cover behind him into the river. Rocks large enough that they made that deep, delayed kerplunk as they hit and sank underneath the water. After 3 or 4 rocks, it stopped. He naturally thought it was me screwing around. It most definitely was not me. This guy is as cool as they come. The look in his eyes when he realized I wasn't joking when I told him it wasn't me. Well, I've never had a chill like that run down my spine since that day, and I hope I never do again. I'm a little creeped out thinking about it again in the warmth of my bed. Needless to say, we didn't sleep great that night. I was riding 4-wheelers with a friend through the woods on his property, and I would have sworn in the moment I heard a deep, growly, and evil voice say, "You better go faster than that." The hair on my neck stood up, and I got the heck out of there. Thinking about it later, it was likely just my brain forming words from the engine and exhaust sounds echoing off the trees. I just remembered another time a buddy and I were hiking out in the woods of a state park uphill from a cabin rental we were staying at. I think we were around 14-15 at the time, and as we were hiking back down, I saw some movement about 50 yards through the trees. We stopped and saw 2 guys in full KKK gear walking up the hill. We headed back down, trying not to draw attention to ourselves. I guess it's not very scary, but it felt that way a little bit back then. My girlfriend and I went on a 14-mile backpacking trip to a beautiful and remote mountain lake. We arrived at the site at sunset and rapidly set up our camp. We were exhausted, but everything was good. First night sleeping there, nothing unusual. The second night, however, let me tell you guys about the second night. My girl and I had settled in our tent for the night. We had a lantern hanging up inside the tent for light, and we were just chilling and talking. Suddenly, we hear distinct bipedal footsteps approach the tent. Whatever, I mean, other people do hike and camp in this area, so whatever, it's not too strange, I guess. We were a little weirded out, but we didn't bother looking out at that point just yet. Then it gets freaky and continues walking right up to the tent. This time we're like, okay, WTF, and we pause and go silent, and we're just listening. A short time passes, and we forget about it. Now once more, we hear footsteps approaching, but this time they're much faster, and it sounds like they're running at the tent. I had a rifle, so I grabbed it and got ready. My girl had a knife, and we no shit braced for whoever this was. We did not feel like it was an animal. Nothing happened. It ran at the tent, and the sound vanished. We got out because we were done being ducked with and were ready to fight if need be. We look around with flashlights and nothing. No sign of anything or anyone. It was the most raw adrenaline rush I've ever gotten while camping, hiking, etc. It still freaks us out to this day when we talk about it. A kangaroo in southwestern Illinois. To this day, no one believes me. This happened in 95 or 96. I was riding my bike down a trail at a campground when I suddenly slammed on my brakes. I don't even know why, and I looked to my left and looked up, and I was looking into the face of a kangaroo. Maybe 5 feet away. I don't know how long that moment lasted, but it was probably only a second or two when it took off and bolted. I saw it for maybe 3 hops, and it was gone. The only reason I think it was a kangaroo and not a deer was 1, how tall it was, and 2, the long, curled tail as it hopped away. It was all over very quickly, and it was very alarming. I never saw it again. It was gray in color. Last year, in late summer, 2 friends and I went camping in BC at a pretty populated campsite. It was supposed to be a super chill evening. We had cooked some food, were sharing a bottle of wine, and stayed up late chatting. The time was about 1 a.m., and we were probably the only people awake at the site as everything was silent around us. All of a sudden, we heard this thumping running sound towards us, and this feeling of dread sank into our bones. I have never been more afraid in my life. What was funny was that at first we thought it was a man, but it must have been huge, as the ground itself shook. It was pitch black, and we had lights on around us, so we couldn't see much beyond our area. Whatever it was charged for lasts us at full speed, and we heard a huge crash into the river beside our site. We ran and hid in the car, and we assumed it was a bear. Even now, when we talk about it, we are still not completely sure, as nothing could begin to describe the feeling of terror we each felt just before we heard the footsteps. To this day, it was the scariest thing that ever happened to me. I was 19, and me and 2 buddies decided to hike for 5 miles, camp, and hike out the next morning. I was living in western Washington at the time, so we were in the rainforest. We got a late start and ended up starting the hike at about 10 p.m., when it was already dark. Night hikes are fun, though, so we didn't think much of it. We're about an hour into it. As we're about to round a corner, we hear this blood-curdling shriek from right around the corner in front of us. Had to be less than 20 yards away. We heard it again, this time slightly farther away, and realized it was a cougar. I had never heard of one before, but my friend recognized it. It sounded just like a woman being murdered. I've never been more terrified. We just stood there huddled up and talking, trying to make noise, while one of us held a knife, because there was only one between the 3 of us. If it makes you feel better, if you see the cougar, you probably aren't in danger. It's the ones you don't see. So I was camping with my church youth group one year, and we were camping on one of the group's leaders' properties that was right on the edge of a forest. Anyways, a group of us decided to mess with one of the older kids, he was 17 then, by jump scaring him with one of those serial killer hockey masks. It was very juvenile, I know. So one of us goes to see if he's in his tent. They walk up and yell, "Hey, are you in there?" And we hear a responsive "Go away" in his voice. So the kid with the mask went up to his tent and tried to shake it, then popped out wearing the mask, but that's when we realized he wasn't there. We're confused, so we head back to the main group up at the fire, where we find the kid who said he'd been at the fire for the past 2 hours. Mind you, there was no way for him to have gotten from his tent to the fire before us. The scariest part was that night, when I heard footsteps walking around my tent all night, along with the howls of a group of coyotes out in the woods. I still joke that we were visited by skinwalkers. I was hunting in the early morning, maybe 15 minutes before sunrise. I was sitting on the side of a mountain or hill, and it was just starting to get light when a rock about the size of a basketball came hurling at me from below. It landed maybe 5 yards away from me, so it wasn't too close. I was mostly confused because I didn't hear anything when it was thrown. I just saw it arch up from under me and land beside me with no explanation of how. Once it got to be about noon, I got up to leave and decided to try to throw it myself. It got like 5 feet away when I threw it downhill. It was way too heavy for a person to throw like that. I've never told this to anyone, but I have told others about similar instances involving pine cones. One rather large and dense one actually hit the back of my head, but I had a large scarf on, so I was very padded. Just another WTF, the angle of how this hit me makes no sense. Another scary thing is a bear's death moan. I watched one fall off a cliff next to camp and run off. Later that night, I felt like I was in horror. This happened about 20 years ago while hunting with my dad in northern BC. It was a cold October morning, and it was still dark when we parked the truck and started our hike into a clear cut. I was familiar with the area, as we had moose hunted there before. My dad went left, and I went right, and I made my way to the top of a slope to get a better view of the clear cut. I found a stump to sit on, took out my binoculars, and quickly found my dad in the clear cut across the mountain. As soon as I spotted him, I heard something heavy move behind me in the forest, roughly 40 yards away. I'm thinking yes. A moose. I then head towards the forest edge when I hear a scream or screech unlike anything I've ever heard. It didn't sound human and wasn't like any animal I've heard before. It was so loud, and I swear my soul left my body for a few seconds. I turned around and ran down the clear-cut hill as fast as my teenage legs would take me. When I got to my dad, he said he had heard it too and found me in his binoculars, running down the clear cut. He then looked up at the forest edge and said he saw a big, hairy, human-like creature standing about 8 feet tall between 2 birch trees. It stayed for a few seconds, then turned around and was way gone. We got in the truck and went home for the day. We asked elders and relatives about it when we got back, and they called them the forest guardians. It still scares the hell out of me. A few years ago, we had a big church camping trip. It was on one of those 100-person campsites you need to reserve a year in advance that's pretty isolated out. Anyway, I'm up pretty late, chatting before finally calling it a night. It was around 1 a.m., and only 3 other people were still up, my friend and 2 older gentlemen who were still talking away. I go to my tent and fall asleep almost instantly. Anyway, I wake up in the morning, and here's the story I hear. Apparently, about 15 minutes after I fell asleep, my friend heard screams that sounded like help. Everyone else quieted down, and they too heard what sounded like distant yelling, although they couldn't make out what. They took a light and made a quick 5-minute walk in the direction of the sound, but nothing happened. My friend swears it sounded like someone screaming for help. It's possible, but I don't know how likely it is. The main road was about 20 minutes away, and the only way to our campsite was a single road. There was no reason to be anywhere near our site unless you were camping there. No attractions, rivers, etc. Even for hunting, you would be better off going deeper and further out. The next night, we stood up again, but this time nothing. When I was a dopey little kid, maybe 10 or 11, I went to a family reunion at a campground. My similarly aged cousin and I were once pulled a gun out and said he was going to make us stop cutting down trees. Luckily, just then my father, a very tall and imposing man, showed up, and the guy jumped in his car and tore off. My parents called the ranger, and we did get a stern lecture on not cutting off branches in a state park, but that was the end of it, I thought. We were sleeping in an RV that year, which we had borrowed from a neighbor. The next morning, I slept in. My parents had gone to get the fire going, and I was still asleep with the door thankfully locked. Someone tried to open the door to the camper, but I was too tired to get up. When the door wouldn't open, they started pounding and shaking the RV. Then they started yanking and pulling on the windows. I woke up, freaked out, and started screaming. All I could see through the frosted glass was a large shadow. Unfortunately, the fire pit was on the opposite side of the door, but just as the stranger got really angry, a ranger car pulled up with lights flashing, and the figure ran. Last year, during the fall, I went camping in Pilot Knoll Park. I went to bed at around 11:30 and woke up about 2 hours later, at 2:25, because I had to go to the bathroom. On my way back, I heard a noise and looked around. I saw a creature squatting on a tree branch. From the quick glimpse I saw, it had reddish eyes and was a dark color. I was so scared that I ran back to my tent and stayed still until I fell asleep. When I woke up, I and my friends packed up and left. I have seen it twice after the experience, once in the forest near my home, where it was standing in the distance. I saw it upright with its head hunched over, and once more at Pilot Knoll, where I noticed it had 2 claws on each hand and foot. My friend claims that he saw it once when hunting, where he claimed it hung out around his truck. He says he saw two thin things protruding from the top of its head. Me and my friends started calling it the red-eyed man and also the knoll man. That's all I have seen of this thing and all I know. I don't know if it has feathers, fur, or scales. I don't know if it has sharp teeth or flat teeth. If you know about the knoll man or have seen it, I am very interested. Was mountain biking. I have a couple of LED lights for night riding, a wide floodlight on my handlebars, and a narrow beam spotlight on my helmet. I'm in Florida and was riding through a swampy jungle when I noticed the trail was covered with these little, sparkly, emerald green shiny things. I assumed they were crystals like quartz or something, except that the trails are mostly sand and shouldn't have anything like that. So I decided to stop and see what the reflection was, and it was light reflecting back from the eyes of a giant wolf spider. Arg! The trail is covered with spiders. Literally hundreds and hundreds of them. And those are only the ones facing me. Another time on the same trails, I was flying down a long straightaway, and up ahead, I could see a pair of eyes on the trail reflecting back at me. They were low to the ground, so I thought they were a raccoon, a possum, or something. As I got closer, they started to rise up. And up. And up some more, until they were, it seemed, as tall as a person. Just as the creature got into range of my spotlight, it turned around and bolted into the trees. I only saw it back in my spotlight for a moment, but whatever it was big and covered in medium brown hair. I'm guessing it was a deer, but I'm not sure, and I wasn't sticking around to find out. 1 year ago this weekend, I took a solo backpacking trip to the Otter Creek Wilderness in West Virginia. The plan was for a 16-mile loop over one night. Due to an impassable river, I put camp up about a mile in. Beautiful spot with campsites along the river and wonderful weather. I hung out, hiked around, and enjoyed the solitude. I had not and have not seen another person since entering the forest roads. Mid-afternoon, I decide to lay down in the tent and just relax or nap. I'm awoken after about 45 minutes by the sound of a metallic clattering. Closest description, take a round fire pit or large grill grate and drop it on its side. And it's close. Of course, I assume other people. Nothing. There was no sign of anyone anywhere, and there was nothing in the area that could have accounted for that sound. Curious and confused, I go about my day. Later, we explored more, had dinner and a fire, and enjoyed the forest night. Around 9:30, I heard a distinct single knock come from the hillside above me. As I turned to shine a flashlight in that direction and saw nothing, another single knock came from over my left shoulder, closer to the river. I don't think it was across the river, as it was pretty clear. Suddenly feeling not alone, I packed up and headed out. I slept in my truck with no other issues. I'm well aware of knocking reports. Anyone have anything similar to the metallic sound experience? I went camping 6 years ago with a now ex-boyfriend of mine. The campsite we picked was beautiful, and we were able to drive in through some rough trails. The spot we picked was next to some hiking trails that weren't very far from some natural hot springs and a huge waterfall. We were in the middle of nowhere, absolutely no one was around. We set up camp next to the car, went hiking, soaked in the hot springs, came back, and had dinner. It was all very normal. Until we woke up the next day. Before we went to sleep, I put our food cooler and a stereo that we brought in the car and locked them. I put the keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent, away from the door of the tent. My boyfriend at the time slept near the door of the tent with a gun next to him. We woke up the next morning, and I felt fine. I had slept hard, and from inside the tent, everything seemed normal. When we got out, our campsite was absolute chaos. The fire pit we had made was ruined. The cooler had been thrown, and food was scattered all over the place. The stereo was smashed to pieces and laid next to a tree. All of the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood there for a minute in silence, just taking everything in. The woods felt off now, it was quiet and not the beautiful campsite that I saw yesterday. Everything about those woods feels wrong now. My ex accused me of not locking the car the night before and that an animal got in our stuff. I promised that I had locked it and went into the tent to grab the keys from my backpack, but they weren't there. I found them later on the ground, right next to the car. We quickly threw everything in the trunk and left. My boyfriend was quiet and wouldn't talk to me about what had just happened. He finally spoke up when we were almost home and told me that he had had a dream the night before about something kneeling over him in the tent, holding his gun, and just staring at him. When I tried to ask him more questions, he got quiet again and said he didn't want to talk about it and that I shouldn't talk about it anymore either. I've tried to forget about it, but I just can't. Something really wrong happened to us in the woods that night. One time, me and my best friend were camping by the lake and decided we wanted to go on a night hike. It was like 30 minutes until sunset, and the trail was about 8 miles. While we were walking, we saw these weird lights in the forest that looked like tail lights, but we knew there was no tail and the woods were way too thick to drive a car into the woods, so we decided to go a little off the trail to find them, and they just kept going deeper and deeper into the woods, so we decided to head back, but when we turned around, we didn't recognize where we were, and it was getting dark, so we knew the lake was about southwest, so we used the sun on the horizon to find our way back to the trail, and by the time we got there, we had been walking for 20 minutes, but we were 6 miles in on the trail. It still blows my mind how we walked off the trail and somehow cleared 6 miles in that much time. But to make it worse, the entire time we were walking through the woods, something was following us. We never saw what it was, and to make it a little less spooky, we joked about silly things. It could be like a puppy or a garden gnome, but in reality, we were both freaking out internally. It took us 2 hours to hike back to our camp. When I was a teenager, I was camping with some friends in an alpine hut. I would have been 14-15-ish. We'd hiked in through the bush and hadn't seen anyone else since we were dropped off that morning. It was late at night, in the middle of winter. I was the only one still awake. It was a full moon, and moonlight was streaming in through the window, casting a big light patch on the wall opposite me. I remember it clearly, right down to the shadow of the cross between the window panes. Imagine, if you will, someone walking up behind you as you face towards a wall with the headlights of a car behind you. I'm sure you can imagine the way you would see their shadow, clearly humanoid, looming up alongside your own. Well, lying there on the floor of this old hut, with only one person awake, I saw that shadow. In the rectangle of moonlight opposite me, I saw a shadow like that of a person walking towards the hut grow up the wall over about 20 seconds. It even swayed slightly from side to side, as a person's shadow would with each footstep. When the shadow was filling about 3/4 of the moonlit space on the wall, it suddenly shot to the side, as if a person had suddenly dived away to avoid being seen. I got up and looked out the door, and there was no one there. I woke up my best friend and told him I thought someone was outside. We went all around the hut, and there was no one out there. We called out into the night, and there was no response. We were about 20 kilometers from the nearest highway, on a remote bush track, so it's not like there were many casual passers-by. There were certainly no vehicles nearby that we could hear the sound of, and like I said, we hadn't seen anyone since that morning when we were dropped off. It is pretty much the most unnerving thing I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like it since, and to this day, I can't think of a rational explanation for it. I've spent my life in Georgia and love hiking all over, but I must admit North Carolina has the best mountains. For this reason, I frequently drive up there and hike and camp. This time, I went up with my family in an RV and stayed with them in Maggie Valley. The next day, however, I had them drop me off about 10 miles away at the cold mountain trailhead, and I planned to hike up, spend the night, and be back down in the morning. I was by no means inexperienced at hiking or camping, but I had never camped alone. On top of that, I didn't bring a pistol, something I won't go without now. On the way up, the trail was surprisingly strenuous. Not necessarily steep. I've hiked some steep stuff out west, but more like a ton of ups and downs and feeling like it wouldn't end. Eventually, it began to get darker, and I realized I needed to stop and set up while I still had light, so I stopped about half a mile short of the summit and figured I would continue in the morning. Nothing eventful happened. I set up camp in a really good spot, ate my food, and went into the tent. At this point, I realized I hadn't run into a single other person my entire way up. This wasn't eerie at the time, but soon would be. I have trouble sleeping and usually lay awake for up to an hour trying to sleep. During this, I thought I heard someone lightly walking around the general area because of the rhythm of the steps. I brushed it off as my mind was running wild, but I did pull my big old knife out of my bag and put it next to me in the sleeping bag. That morning, I woke up and ate oatmeal. As I ate, I looked over at my tent and noticed a strange bundle of dried twigs and berries tied with green cord propped against my tent. I'll see if I can find a picture and put it in the comments. Internally, I was pissing myself, but I packed my crap up and took off within 5 minutes. And no way bothered to go to the summit, I headed straight down. On the way down, I realized there was a pretty heavy fog, and I ended up on a side trail that eventually ended, and I was lost. I used a compass to eventually reorient myself and found the trail again, one of the biggest reliefs. I made it out with no other incidents. However, I came to find out the same morning a 27-year-old died on the same section of trail as me, and it's possible I would have run into him had I not gotten lost and rejoined the trail later. His family seems to have scrubbed the internet of several of the articles on him, but I'll see if I can find something. The scariest part was knowing that someone knew where I was and watched me, and I had no clue about them. Also, the circumstances surrounding the guy's death are weird. You can find articles about him. He supposedly fell trying to climb out of a ravine, but was away from his backpack and had called 911 but didn't get to speak to anyone on the line. We found our camping spot at night when we took a chance on the second dirt road we came across. The first one led to a van that was open where someone had already started a fire and had their clothes or food hanging on lines. The spot is a dirt road that curves around a cliff that overlooks a meadow sprinkled with trees here and there, then the hill steeps up and creates the mountain. In the morning, in the light, even with your hangover and baking in the tent, it's breathtaking. We know the valley is unoccupied. Twice in the night, I've heard drums. Like native drums. Being native myself, I convinced myself I was hearing things. Eventually, in the lull in the conversation with my loved ones, I had the balls to ask. Does anyone else hear that? The answer was yes. The music was turned off and down, and I could feel their fear, wondering what it was and looking at me as if I could explain. I could not. The next morning, there was no evidence that other people could have been around. It happened again on the next trip. Seasoned campers were totally shocked by an evil feeling from the woods. We camped all the time. Throughout college, we would spend our entire spring, fall, and winter breaks camping. When our kids were small, still in those baby car seats, we loaded them in the van and took them along, spending several days blissfully in the woods as a family. Once, when the kids were both at the grandparents', we decided to camp in the national forest a few hours away for the weekend, just the two of us. We arrived at a rural spot, put up the tent, built a fire, and settled in for the evening. As the night wore on, I got this creepy feeling of being watched, but I have been made fun of for spooking at foxes and such, so I kept quiet. I noticed my husband looking around, behind me in the dark forest. He finally whispered, "Do you feel that?" I knew exactly what he meant when he said, "Evil?" And he nodded. Then we were wondering what to do. It was almost midnight, and we both knew we wouldn't be able to sleep or even relax. In fact, I almost suggested we just get in the car and go, leaving everything behind. We made the fire bigger for a bit, then packed up as fast as possible, looking around us the whole time. It was awful. I kept thinking we wouldn't make it out of the woods. We drove the 2 hours home and sat up the rest of the night once we got there, didn't talk about it, but just stayed awake. Here's the thing. We don't scare that easily. We are not religious, so evil doesn't have that kind of meaning for us. We have had other campers, drunk, lost, walk up to our fire late at night, hunters looking for lost beagles, foxes, a coyote, and other scavengers, and we just handled them all in the calmest way possible, never fearful. This was different. That was about 20 years ago, and I've never been camping again. Years ago, when my grandma passed away, we had to go from one side of the US to the other as soon as possible for the funeral. Well, we got to Oklahoma real late one night of the drive, and my folks stopped at the only motel available. I don't remember the name or place, but it was like time forgot it or something. Old cabin log buildings, and it backed up to a forest area that had initially been partly cleared to make the road connect to the interstate. That didn't happen, and nature was slowly reclaiming the road. Well, my folks went to sleep, and my brother and I went for a walk down a path that was semi-asphalt and semi-overgrowth. It led to a dead end where you could see the highway about a mile away in the dark. We walked about a mile and smoked a joint on the way. Well, my brother said time to head back, and we started off, and me, being a lightweight, started chuckling and chatting on the walk back. He grabbed my arm hard as shit and looked in my face seriously, and we kept walking, all the while making eye contact with me, darting his eyes left to right, and walking quick but not running. We made it to the clearing at the motel parking area, and I walked up to the nearest stairs, jogged up, looked down, and saw my brother staring at a humongous white wolf thing. He walked backward slowly, and the thing eventually trotted off like a horse. It was that big. It was super mangy and had some patches missing, and you could tell it was hungry as shit. We probably made it back just in time. We still talk about it to this day, nearly 20 years later. BTW, my brother is tough as nails, and I'm dedicated and hardworking but kind of a pushover in the outdoorsman area. Several years ago, my so and I had to bust a mission to a place in Apple Valley, a desert kind of area in California, to these hot springs I had camped at. Our goal in mind was to recover this rental car, that was rented in my name, that my buddy had gotten stuck on a 4WHL drive-only steep dirt trail. I had met the owner of the lands of the hot springs before, since he lives inside the log cabin that's built before you enter the parking area and start on the trail down to the springs. He was like a grumpy troll, mostly due to some disrespectful assholes who had come to his land and brought their guns and treated it like a shooting range and littered everywhere. Keeping his demeanor in mind from the first time I met him, I told my so to shut up and let me do the talking because I knew if I could get the owner to soften up, he'd help me the next day to find the lost vehicles and also help tow them with his Wrangler. We end up getting along and talking, and he invites me into the cabin. He starts explaining how he came to own the grounds and how they used to be Native American land, and he is extremely energetically charged. And I had already camped here once before and felt that way without being told about the grounds. I mentioned to him that I was Native myself, and he said he was too. We shared one of the same tribes and bonded over it. I then gifted him an item I kept in my car from a POW wow I had attended before. He decides that he'll help me recover my car and that we'll do it first thing in the morning. And he says I'm welcome to park my car wherever I want around the property so we can crash and meet later. Then, in a slight joking way, he says to me, "Good luck." My car was a Scion TC. So it's a 2-door hatch. Has a moon and sun roof. If you slide the front seats up all the way and lay down the back seats, you can scrunch into it for a night of sleep. So me and so find a trail to park on, maybe a mile or two away from the cabin. Next morning we wake up, pop open the trunk, hatch back, and get out to take a morning pee. We both go separate ways, and then when we get back to the car, we notice a set of tracks that started from where some bushes are and stopped overlooking my back windscreen and back seat windows. The tracks were 1 hoof print and 1 foot print. Side by side. It only led up to my car, and there was no trail of prints leaving or heading away. It freaked out me and my so, who had also grown up on a farm and outdoors and is familiar with most things. We both had stinging eyes, and, oh my god, something was watching us. I see the owner the same morning to get my car, and gleefully he says, "Great, glad to see you guys were good through the night." I never mentioned to the landowner what we had seen on that path. To this day, neither I nor my so have any idea. Anyone know what this is or have experienced it? So my husband and I and our 3-year-old love camping, hiking, and anything else that we can do outdoors. We came upon a paranormal site at one point that led us to nearby areas. One in particular stood out, the road to nowhere. This is a tunnel that is supposedly haunted, and as the name suggests, it ends not far off after you get out of the tunnel. It seems interesting, so we go. We set up in Deep Creek Campgrounds, which we just found out is also a paranormal spot where people have gone missing. Day 1 comes to a close. On day 2, we head to the tunnel. Very few people are around, there is somewhat of a parking lot, and it's quiet. We go through the tunnel. This is where it all gets a bit weird. What should have been a 10-minute walk turns into 30. We were not really panicking, but we were still not out of this damn tunnel. We were filming and realizing the timestamp on the camera kept changing. The phone was fairly useless but kept showing weird times, notifications, etc. Finally, we reach the end, and I decide there's no way I'm going back through. Here's our second mistake. There's a trail going across the tunnel. My husband wants to go back through and meet us while I and our daughter go over the top to wait. At the top, the trail ends, which is unusual but not a big deal as I can see the trail we came up, and my husband will be coming up shortly. I take pictures, full panoramas, everything. Never out of sight of the trail. Husband shows up, and we start looking around for the next trail or any trail, never going more than 150 feet in any direction alone while one of us stands near the trail. We decide we can't find it, so we head back down the trail. The trail is no longer where it was. But that's okay because I took pictures of some unusual trees and things, so I'll use them as markers. I open the pictures, and all of them are time-stamped wrong, the images are different. The entire skyline 100 feet away, mountains, etc. is completely different. And now we start to get worried. We look for nearly 3 hours, how to get down, how to find the trail back, nothing. Finally, we realized we were fairly screwed and started planning what we were going to do. At which point the glitchy phone gets a phone call and we realize it works. We call 911, which puts us through to a ranger rescue team. They find us maybe an hour later, mere feet from a trail, and 1 entire mile from the tunnel. At this point, we go on our merry way and decide we will never hike again. Which we probably will because, well, why not? In the early 90s my parents sent me to a YMCA summer camp in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. It was called Matolyoniki and was located on the shores of a series of man-made lakes in Medford Lakes, so not exactly backwoods. We all knew the stories of the Jersey Devil, but the camp had a few of its own ghost stories. The White Lady, said to have jumped off a bridge on her wedding day, and Hatchet Harry, an axe-wielding maniac who got kids who wandered into the woods. Both stories I assume were to keep kids from wandering off. What I encountered was neither of those. I woke up in the middle of the night in my bunk, hearing some rustling in the bushes. The cabins were basically a half wall with screened windows all around, save for the back wall, with 8 bunk beds, 4 on each side. You could lay in your bunk and look right out the windows. It really sucked when it rained because there were no shutters to close. I had heard this rustling, so I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into the bushes across from the front of the cabin, sweeping from bottom to top. There was nothing else in that direction save for woods, as our cabin group was right on the edge of the camp. I didn't see anything out there, so I put my flashlight out and got ready to settle back in, but then this light appeared. It was this bluish-white light, flickering slightly, sort of like a firefly. The light slowly followed the same path my flashlight had traced, bottom to top, then disappeared. It scared the hell out of me, but I didn't bother to waste reserve that I won't reveal due to privacy reasons. Across the road from us is a creek. If you keep following the creek downstream, about 900 meters, with 3 creek crossings, you'll find a fence, which is at the edge of the reserve. This area could be considered a dead-sounding area. If you keep following the fence away from the road, you'll find where an abandoned meth lab used to be that has a bunch of creepy shit around it. One time we found a mini noose, and if you keep going past that by like 150 meters, you'll find an old tow trailer that's been obliterated with bullet holes. The majority of my coworkers always avoid this place, as it's known to be an area related to high-level creepy paranormal activity. This area is of high interest to me, and I feel heavily drawn to it, despite my heavy sense of dread. I feel as if there's something that needs to be discovered there, and for some reason whatever entity or, I guess, forest guardian wants me to be the one to do so, or at least that's what I believe. My intuition tells me something bad happened there, and I've always been a bit spiritual. I dislike going to this area alone, and the second time I've gone to explore it was around 10:30 at night, pitch black, and 2 of my friends that I brought along were being complete idiots and singing and being, I guess, in a way, shit disturbing whatever energy form was there. Whatever the entity was, it appeared to my one friend as we were traveling back. He said it was around 4 feet tall and ran on all 4s back into the woods and across the fence. It made some kind of noise right next to me, and the best way I could describe it was that it sounded almost exactly like a bow drill. I even caught it on video. I believe this was a warning or scare for us to leave the forest, and we booked it out of there. I've tried doing research on native folklore, myths, or stuff that appears in the forests near the Rocky Mountains on the Alberta side, but I haven't had any luck. So in 2005, when I was 13 and in my 3rd year of secondary school, I took part in an outdoor team building scheme called the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme. For anyone outside of the British Isles, it's when you go on an expedition hill walking and mountaineering trip in groups of about 6 for 2 nights and 3 days. So on the last night, we ended up camping right in the middle of Ballyboley Forest with all of the other groups. It was at the very foot of a fire break, a long, thin stretch of ground with no trees, which means you can see for quite some distance with nothing hindering your vision. There were no teachers or leaders at this campsite, so naturally all hell broke loose. At about 8:15 p.m., as the light was beginning to dim, someone in another group began to ramble on about seeing people at the other end of the firebreak moving about between the trees. In case it was another group that had gotten lost, a few of us marched up the firebreak to check it out. It was about a 5-minute walk, and there was nothing but more trees and shrubbery, not a road or a natural footpath in sight. It wasn't taken very seriously until about an hour later. We were all gathered around a gas stove having hot chocolate when someone else noticed some kind of movement down at the far end of the fire break. This time, the figures that had been previously sighted were holding some kind of torches, but this is where it got a bit stranger. Rather than modern torches or maglights, the figures seemed to be holding what were either branches that had been set on fire or some kind of oil lantern that you held out in front of you. We counted 4 of these figures. Someone later that night claimed that, after the figures vanished, they could hear sounds like an abattoir in the distance, echoing the cries and squeals of animals. Needless to say, after the figures vanished, our young imaginations ran wild, and we began to assume the worst was about to happen. In a small and very religious country like Northern Ireland, you are brought up hearing of stories of witchcraft and devil worship that supposedly take place in secluded forests, and it took a lot of discussion and freaking out before we decided that someone should ring the nearest teacher with our group's emergency mobile phone. But eventually, more rational voices began to pipe up and assure the more frantic campers that it was probably just other groups in the forest. The firebreak stretched very far back, about a kilometer, and we decided the best course of action was for everyone to go to their tents, keep torches handy, and stick together. The next morning, save for a few rumors of figures and lights being seen running around the tents, we laughed it off and carried on with the expedition. Eventually, it was rarely spoken about, and it became one of those stories that, as you get older, you find yourself struggling to remember if it was real or a dream. Fast forward 8 years. Now 22, I was flicking through articles on internet when I came across one called 10 Most Haunted Forests on Earth. It contained some of the usual ones, like the Suicide Forest in Japan, but I was amazed to see Ballyboley Forest was included at number 5. It mentioned the usual paranormal activity that describes a lot of old places, but it intrigued me enough that I decided to research things a bit deeper. Then I came across a website called The Shadowlands, which documents real ghosts and unexplained stories in Ireland. In its segment on Ballyboley Forest, it explains how locals believed it was the site of Druid rituals and sacrifices and how some of the stone formations and trenches they created are still there. But every hair on my body stood on end when I read. On another date, 1997, this is actually in a newspaper report, 2 men say that they were in the forest when they heard a loud flapping sound. They thought nothing of it at first, but as they continued walking, they started to hear other strange sounds, like a lady moaning in pain. Their horror began when they came to a place where the trees were smeared thickly with blood. As they fled in terror, one man looked behind him and saw 4 human-shaped figures in the forest behind him, standing motionless, not pursuing, where previously there had been no one there. 4 figures. Like the 4 figures with lights we witnessed 8 years earlier. Other sites report that the practices of Druids involve the creation of altars to sacrifice animals and then setting them on fire, which goes some way to explaining the abattoir-esque noises someone claimed to hear. It was so surreal to read, so long after the event took place, such eerily similar accounts and descriptions. What do you think? So about 3 years ago, I went camping with my girlfriend, now ex, as she had always expressed interest but never had been. The spot we went to is in the Huron National Forest and is my go-to trail or camp spot as it's hidden deep in the forest and access to the trails is close and easy, for ATVs, etc. My family has been going to this spot for about 6 years, and my friends introduced me about 10 or so years ago. We went on a weekend trip, and I'm glad we didn't go any longer. When we got there, everything was going well, except we did notice a group of people that were hanging out next to our campsite, but they were just stargazing and ended up leaving. Then, around midnight, the weird stuff started to happen. At first, it sounded like someone was laughing at us, but the laugh never ended and got very high-pitched and sounded as it kept going. After a while, we both got kind of scared and went into the tent to try and sleep, and then that's when the laughter and noise moved up higher and then started to circle the campsite. After a while of that happening, it just suddenly stopped and then started again around 3 a.m. when it started again. The fire was going out, so I went to stoke the fire with my shotgun in hand and turned on my flashlight to see if maybe I could see any coyotes or something around the campsite, but I didn't see anything or hear any movements below. This went on until 6 a.m. and then stopped, and that was finally when we were able to get some rest. After we woke up, we checked around the campsite and didn't see anything out of the ordinary, so we packed up. Once we were packed up and good to go, I went to start my vehicle, and it was completely dead. That really freaked me out, as I'm always paranoid about leaving things plugged in that kill the battery. I made sure everything was closed properly and unplugged, yet somehow the battery still died. I was able to get a jump from AAA, that phone call was hard to explain, and the lady who took the call didn't believe me, but at the end we both laughed. After that happened, I told my friend, who had shown me the campsite and also has a cabin in the same forest, roughly 25 miles away from the campsite, about what happened, and he got freaked out. He told me about 2 incidents, one at the campsite and one at his cabin. At the campsite, he stated that one night after we had all returned from trail riding and gone to bed, he stayed up to hang out by the fire and have a few drinks. While he was hanging out, he was just looking off into the distance and saw a pair of eyes up in the trees looking directly at him. He described them as bioluminescent eyes, and he flashed his high-powered flashlight at them, but there was nothing there, and as soon as the flashlight turned off, they were there looking right back at him, so he packed up and went right to bed. He didn't tell us because he didn't want to scare us. At the cabin, he was hanging out with his brother, and they were both just chilling by the fire outside when they both saw a pair of eyes looking at them from a trail that leads into the woods. They stated that at the height the eyes were looking at them, whatever it was had to be 7 feet or taller. They started shooting at it with their rifles, 230/30s, and the eyes disappeared, but once they were done, they reappeared and were closer. At that point, they both freaked out and got back in the cabin, and they did not leave until daylight. We have no idea what this could have been, but we all felt very scared when these events were happening. After we all talked about it, one of the brothers thinks it's a Wendigo, SP? I don't really know what it could be, but I haven't felt that scared since. This was the most terrifying moment of my life, and it always will be. My family and a family friend's family were going on a hiking trip to the Appalachian Mountains. We had rented cabins at a camping site and had arranged certain paths to follow each day of our trip, 4 days long, that we would walk each day. The first 3 days went great, we saw wildlife, had a good time, and talked a lot. But on the 4th day, we were taking a trail that was more secluded and overgrown than the others. We were walking for about 30 minutes when I was hit with this overwhelming feeling of uneasiness. The feeling just stayed there, no matter how hard I tried to beat it back. Then, and everyone else on the hike denies this, I hear singing in a language that I've never heard before. It's like the singing described in the myth of the sirens, sweet and enchanting, yet the music invoked a feeling of fear, down to my bones. Everyone else seems completely oblivious to it. I tried telling my dad that something was wrong, but he just told me I was probably tired and that we would stop soon. So, about 5 minutes later, the singing just kept getting louder, and my heart was racing. We had stopped to rest and eat something as well. I wish with all my heart that we hadn't stopped. About 2 minutes into our little rest, the singing is still getting progressively louder, but my nerves have settled slightly. Then, everything falls silent. Everyone in our group, about 12 people, suddenly turns to the trees to our left. A figure tall and in a black cloak was barely visible between the trees. It was a woman, much taller than normal people are, with pure white hair flowing out of her hood. Her head is down, but her face is still slightly visible. All I can make out is that her skin is very pale yellow, like old paper. As we watch, she just stalks closer to our group, finally stopping right at the edge of the trees. She looks up, and I swear to God that as long as I live and breathe, I will never forget her face. Her eyes are completely white, with no pupils or irises visible. She had a thin, pointed nose and a mouth with lips that were stained red. I don't want to know why. She stares at us for a moment and then smiles. It was horrifying. She had no teeth, and her eyes began to shine. She then begins to talk. She had a horrible scratchy, high-pitched voice and said, "Leave this place while you still can. I'll be watching you, don't try anything." I blink, and she's gone. Everyone is silent. This is my first time telling this story to anyone else who didn't experience this with me, and I never discussed it with anyone who did experience this with me. It feels good to share this experience with someone. A few years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles, 8,500 kilometers, around the western US. I did this trip solo. At night, I most often preferred to go to a wild camp, simply finding somewhere to disappear into the woods, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. The forest doesn't exactly make for a quiet night's sleep, but after the first few weeks, I found comfort in that. The constant droning of thousands of crickets and toads was all but a certainty. It was always a highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes, and I fondly recall one evening I set up camp right between a pair of owls who spent much of the night hooting back and forth. If nothing else, it wouldn't take much of a breeze to stir music in the tree canopy. In late September, I'd found my way to western Montana. I was in a quite remote part of the state and had little trouble finding a place to set up camp on this particular night. As I went through my usual evening routine, pitching the tent, writing the day's final journal entry, and so on, I didn't notice anything unusual. Once I turned out my light and laid down in bed, though, I came to a disturbing realization. It was dead silent. There was not a single cricket chirping, certainly no coyotes. There was no babbling of a nearby creek, and even the air between the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees was at a standstill. It was truly and completely silent. And that was terrifying. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever heard. It felt as though the entire forest was trying to hide from something, like an equally silent predator. Suddenly, the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the cacophony of other noises, rang out like a gunshot. I slept terribly that night, and I'll never forget the immense relief I felt with the first bird song of the pre-dawn hour. This takes place in southern Kentucky, between the ages of 19 and 24. Generally, my partner in crime, Kay, is always involved. Whistling in the woods. There's a lookout point down the road where Kay used to live, back down in the holler, that he loved to go to all the time. He will not reveal his location because it's too close to where his family lives. I had to hike about 30 minutes up a mountainside to get there. A decent little hike. We decided to go up one day and ended up dicking around too long and underestimated how quickly it'd get dark. Kay is terrified of being in the woods after dark. There is no particular reason for this, but his imagination is a bit too healthy. He's scared of shit like Wendigos, while I'm scared of crazy Leroy with a shotgun, or more specifically, his crazy ducking uncle. His irrational fears have worked against me on multiple occasions. So we start trying to make it down the mountain in complete darkness as quickly and safely as we possibly can. We didn't anticipate this, and our only source of light was his cheap cell phone, which he insisted on clutching. Duck me right. He's whimpering and crying to himself the entire way, which isn't helping my nerves. Then we hear a whistle. Just a short whistle. From behind and a little off to the side. Another whistle answers. This time in front of us. A call and response ensue, and this continues to follow us all the way down the mountain. Once we get to the road, it stops. I've always been told that bobcats do this and are likely to follow us the whole way. Which, in a way, seems scarier than if they had screamed. In college, I lived up on top of a mountain road, but it was still only 5 minutes to town down a trail through the woods. There was a 100-plus-year-old oak in the yard and a slab stone porch built by hand. I lived in the studio apartment that was outside of the main house. The main house was haunted, but my shack was cozy. The woods up there were weird too. I was never really in the main house at all, but the three who lived there said some nights you couldn't sleep for all the noise. Floorboards creaking, thumps and knocks, etc. My experiences happened outside. Like I said, I hunted small game up there, as there must have been a rabbit colony in the vicinity plus a few squirrelries. Often out there, while I was stalking, I'd get the distinct feeling of being stalked myself. Keep in mind that this stand of forest is only several acres, but it was preserved mainly because of the historic oak trees scattered around. It's old wood. I would hear laughter, like children's laughter, but not quite like in a creepy movie. It was a bit distorted, almost like flirty giggles you might imagine a fairy would make. It would come from a different direction each time I sought it. I eventually decided to stop following it and hunt. It never stopped. I would sometimes spend an afternoon in town having drinks or hanging out at my friend's place. I'd finally leave and have enough liquid courage to hike back up by the trail in the dark. That laughter would be replaced by noise. Just like things running all around you and dashing about the trees. I've been an outdoorsman for a long time, and I know the woods are noisy at night, particularly in the southern Appalachians, but this was different. It was dead silent out there in that stand at night, except for this rushing to and from by some unseen feet. Not like game fleeing, though. Deer run away and crash about doing it. These steps were like something or things running swiftly around me. It's like it would cross the trail up ahead, then behind me, then alongside. But I could never see anything. I was a big night owl back then and was regularly up doing schoolwork until 3 or 4 a.m. one such night. It had just snowed a fresh 20 or so, a decent accumulation for the area. Our yard and the woods were like a paradise for me and my dog. I was excited to hunt around the next day for tracks and see if I couldn't locate the rabbit den precisely. I was up working, and the dog came scratching to get in, not frantic or anything. I let her in, and she lay down to sleep. Odd because she's husky and prefers the snow to my tiny, heated apartment every time. I decided to call it a night too and went out for a cigarette. It was 3:24 a.m. I can still see it on top of my MacBook display from before I closed it. I went out and noted the clouds were dispersed a bit, and the moon was bright on the snow. I lit my cigarette and was just looking out across the fence and into the woods when something caught my eye. It looked just like a silhouette of somebody leaning against one of those big oak trees. Like, you'd see somebody with a palm planted against a wall with the arm straight out, leaning against it. It's not moving, so I can't tell if I'm just tired or the lighting is funny or what, so I walked further to the end of the porch, and as soon as I stepped on the fresh snow there, it took off. The thing was tall. My estimates based on that tree put the thing at 7 feet. It ran along the border of the fence and backed off into the woods. It was hairless, as far as I can tell, and completely naked. Otherwise, though, its form was just that of a skinny, tall man. I went inside and switched to boots, grabbed my rifle and my flashlight, and went to check the tracks. I picked up a set of what had to be size 14 or 15 barefoot tracks. It ran along the fence and down the treeless stretch of backyard as if heading into the woods, but then the tracks just ended about 20 short of the wood line. I don't know if it jumped to the tree line, I probably could have, but there weren't any more tracks that I could find that night or the next day. It was like it just vanished. I could never explain that one. It was September in central Idaho. Autumn had come to the mountains, and with it, bow hunters were looking for mountain goats. My cousin, let's call him Vern for anonymity's sake, is an avid hunter. He's been all over North America hunting various game. Bears in Alaska. Wild hogs in Texas. Bighorn sheep in Wyoming. But his favorite hunting area was the Lemhi mountain range in central Idaho. Our extended family has been hunting in those mountains for generations. We know every river bottom and mountain peak like many people know their own neighborhoods. Mountain goats are fascinating animals to hunt. They live well above the tree line in rocky environments. They are sure-footed and can climb near vertical slopes. Hunting these animals requires one to venture into these dangerous areas. You have to be mindful as you pursue an animal like that. One wrong step on a rocky slope or one loose rock could mean you're not going home ever again. Vern was an expert mountain hunter. It's something he was born to do. Vern decided to hunt in the Hayden River area of the Lemmus. It's a familiar spot to most locals, and the area is home to plenty of mountain goats. The first mile of Vern's hike was uneventful as he climbed up the canyon. The air was crisp, and his breath formed in great plumes as he progressed. The sun was just peeking over the mountains when Vern came to a small deer trail. He decided it might be a nice shortcut from his usual route and took it. A few hundred feet up the trail, he saw something odd pop out from behind a tree. It was a man. He was dressed in a light denim coat and jeans and was carrying a small backpack. My cousin stopped for a second to get his bearings, unsure of where this guy came from. The man waved at him with both arms. One of them was holding an older-style hunting bow. Acknowledging him, Vern waved back. Although the man looked to be physically fine, it was clear he was emotionally distressed. He yelled out something my cousin couldn't quite hear and waved his arm, indicating my cousin should follow him. Vern didn't get any bad vibes from this man and could tell he was genuinely in need of some help. He began to make his way up the canyon, following this mystery man. Vern could never gain any ground on this guy. He was always just far enough away that he couldn't talk to him. Periodically, the man would stop and turn towards him to make sure Vern was still following. Every time he looked back, Vern could see the worry in his face. My cousin did his best to remain calm and keep a smile on his face. I was unsure of who or what he was being led to. It was peculiar, Vern thought as he hiked. He hadn't seen any other vehicles on his drive up to the trailhead. Perhaps he came in from over another ridge? What could he possibly be leading him to? He figured one of his hunting party members had been hurt and needed help. Of course, he wouldn't have had to speculate if the man just stopped and talked to him for 5 minutes. Vern lost sight of the guy just past a turn in the trail. The trail opened up into an incredibly steep, rocky tailless slope. He looked in every direction and could not locate the man when he heard a whistle. Looking up, he saw the guy about 500 feet up the rocky slope waving at him. There was no possible way he could have gotten up that far in just the short time Vern lost sight of him. He still didn't feel any fear or weariness about this weird situation. The man was waving more frantically now, practically begging Vern to follow him up the slope. With a sigh and a grunt, he started up the rocks. It was slow going. Every other step caused a mini-rock slide and would cause him to continually lose his footing. Huffing and puffing in the cool, thin air, my cousin eventually made it to a small landing. It had taken him almost 45 minutes to get to that spot, where he saw the man from below. There was no earthly way anyone could have done that scramble uphill any faster. Totally exhausted and out of breath, Vern sat down to push the boulder out of the way, and when they did, they found the skeletonized remains of a man. On the body, they found hunting equipment and some personal effects. From a credit card in the wallet, they were able to identify the man. He was a bow hunter who had gone missing almost exactly 53 years beforehand. Vern never wanted to be identified by the public or the missing hunter's family. He didn't want recognition for something like that. To him, it was just one of those bizarre mountain stories. He was happy that the family got closure, even if it was half a century later. The only thing that bothered him was the man leading him up the canyon and his strange and sudden disappearance. He had mentioned the waving man to the sheriff but was brushed off. When news reports came out announcing the discovery, several photos of the man were published. Vern was absolutely shocked when he saw them. In the photos was the man he had seen leading him up the mountain to the body. It finally made sense to him, the man's distressful look. The constant checking if Vern was following him. The sense of relief he felt when the body was discovered. That man was desperate to get home, and through Vern, he was able to be reunited with his family. Back in September of 2008, my best friend Sierra, pronounced Sierra, and I went to a park named Hocking Hills in the American state of Ohio for a day of retreat from our busy lives. We had decided on this at random when we first got together early in the morning, just after sunrise. It was a nice, warm late summer day, and we just got the wild notion to go for a drive to Hocking Hills since the area is well known for its several walking trails, a cave or two, several waterfalls, and running water and creek areas. The day was very warm, maybe roughly 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius, so we had worn shorts and short-sleeved t-shirts. We started down a trail at random and found that part of the trail had been washed out, so we had to take another path, which, according to our phone's GPS tool, would force us to cross a small country road. As we played with our mobile phones and noted it was roughly 12 o'clock noon EST, we happened to be passed by a group of backpackers before we reached the road, and one of the people turned around to warn us to be aware of a washout up ahead if we were going to take the trail into the woods. They recommended we follow the one next to the fire tower instead, as it bypassed a small clump of down brush. As we crossed the road to the tower trail, we noticed there was caution tape all over the fire tower. There was a pungent smell in the air that we could not identify. The windows on top of the tower appeared to be taped up and grimy, and there were flies all over the area. We walked past it, commenting on how odd it was, and continued down the trail we had been recommended to take, but it was one neither of us had noticed before on a previous walk to the area. This trail took us past the fire tower and then cut into the woodlands. As we walked into the forest, maybe 1,500 feet, 457 meters, or so, we took notice that no one seemed to be around, and in fact, not only did we feel isolated from others, but we felt very chilled without explanation. Sierra pointed it out verbally while I was thinking about it, but we just continued walking. Eventually, the air started to get noticeably chillier and damper. This did not seem unusual at first, but as we continued to walk, the air seemed to go from warm to what felt like the mid-50s Fahrenheit or 10 Celsius, and we started to shiver. It was also getting darker as we continued forward. At first, I thought it was just due to the green leaves on the trees and maybe a passing cloud over the head, but the darkness really did not improve as one expected. As we walked, we looked around, and there were nothing but trees on all sides. There should have been a forest edge somewhere, as the area wasn't really that big, but aside from some hills and tall pine trees, there wasn't a real ending to the woods like we expected, as the area tends to be narrow and normally you can see the edges. My friend took out her phone to use her GPS because she instinctively felt lost, but her battery was nearly gone. I took mine out of my back pocket and it had no signal. The battery was also near dead, and it showed EE for the time, meaning it couldn't update as it was an older style flip phone with a camera and, when set to auto adjust, would contact the mobile phone network every 15 minutes. It was only then, as the light grew dimmer, that I noticed the area seemed very silent. Our footsteps, the leaves we stepped on, grass, twigs, and our breathing just echoed. Sierra got spooked, and I did too. She mentioned it was very out of the ordinary, and I agreed, but I couldn't shake this sense of foreboding that something was amiss. I tried to rationalize it, but I really, honestly, couldn't figure any of it out at all. We just pressed onwards, and after going down a small hill and back up, it seemed to have gotten a lot darker. The world seemed to have gone from just shadowy to near twilight darkness. My friend grabbed my arm and started freaking out about how weird it got. Then the air seemed to have gone still, and we had a feeling that something was wrong. We both took off running looking for an exit. For some odd reason, we never thought to turn around at all and just got back the way we came. It never seemed to occur to us as we ran, but the spookiness continued as we could hear our steps echo off the area as things just felt like they grew more gloomy. Then, ahead of us, down another small dip in the trail, we could see two large honeysuckle bushes on either side of the trail, like a gate. We made a mad dash for these bushes, and just as we pushed through the plants, something odd happened. We were overwhelmed by a change in our surroundings as light, sound, and warmth returned all at once. It was like stepping outside of a cold, empty, and dark building onto a warm, busy street. We stood at the edge of a place known as Ash Cave, which has a large waterfall not too far away with a U-shaped cliff. I turned around to look back from where we emerged, and while the bushes were the same, the area was so different, brighter, not silent for sure, and warm. In fact, our skin was too cold to touch, which just reinforced the facts. We took out our phones, and the time had finally updated. It was now 4 p.m. The normal trail would only have taken an hour to walk fully, so it was a loss of 3 full hours. Logic attempted to set in, and we decided the trail we came up with must have just appeared creepy because there may have been clouds over our heads or a storm blowing by, but when we went back between the bushes, there was no trail. Nothing looked like it did a few seconds ago. Sierra walked around the bushes twice, and it was the same bright, sunny day with no darkness and no trail. We waited, there was a blue sky over our heads, and we could see the edges of the forest and other people. The trail had simply vanished, as if we had never walked it. On returning to the normal trail with the washout, we ended up locating an offshoot path, which took us back past the fire tower. It was here that we noticed it was normal looking, as the windows were not taped and very clean, and there was no pungent smell. We don't know what it was, but it certainly was creepy. Of course, I jokingly told her later that day over dinner that we had entered the fairy realms by mistake and were lucky to get away. She didn't find that funny, of course, but either way, we both felt we should share this with you, and if anyone out there has had a similar experience, perhaps they can provide insight or share their own. The other night, my mom and I were camping in Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We are regulars down there, and we spend countless hours on the trails and campsites. We decided to try and find a new spot. We ended up all the way down Indian Creek on 9A, almost at the end of the road. We found a beautiful campsite, and we were so excited to spend the night there. The first strange thing to happen was that I could not start a fire. I can't tell you how many times I have made a fire before. I've never struggled like this time. I went through 8 campfire matches. They are much larger and hold a fire for 15 minutes, almost an entire box of regular matches, a fire starter block just to make things easier, and dry wood. It took me hours to get it going. I blamed the moisture in the air that night. But things continued to get weird. Next, at 2:18 a.m., my mom wakes me up to say there is someone outside our tent, and they have been there for 5 minutes. I wake up and see lights shining down into our tent. You can hear a woman's voice, but we are both paralyzed with fear. We don't look out. We were down a steep hill, and the lights were coming up from the street, only about 300 feet away. The lights did not go away for another 5 minutes. Finally, the lights and voices were gone, but we never heard a car leave. We were on a gravel road in the middle of the night, and the nearest campsite is probably 10 walking minutes away. We would have heard a car. Finally, we fall back asleep after being spooked. At 4:19, we wake up again to my mom's phone playing music. It sounds like a sad funeral song, but it also sounds like it could have been a ringtone on her phone. Neither of us have heard this song before, and neither of us have alarms set. We do not have service, so her phone is in airplane mode. When she picks up the phone, the music just quits playing. She doesn't press any buttons, her screen is still black, and the song just turns off. She didn't receive any notifications from any apps, it's a blank screen, and her music app isn't playing. The next morning, I go through her phone and listen to all the different songs, and that song is not anywhere on her phone. So why did this random song start and end playing on her phone? Plus, when I woke her up, she was telling me about her crazy dream of someone coming up to our tent and asking to come inside. This dream happened twice. In the first dream, a woman comes up and asks to come inside. My mom then tries to grab something for self-defense, and the tent is so large, she can't get to it. In the next dream, a man asks to come into our tent for just a minute, and he says he will leave soon. But when she grabs something for defense, it crumbles in her hand. The guy runs away after he sees people chasing after him. She then wakes up to the weird funeral song playing on her phone. My mom didn't know if those dreams were real or not when she woke up. She never remembers her dreams. That night was just full of weird occurrences. If they happened by themselves, I wouldn't think anything of it. But there was so much in a 12-hour span. It truly felt like we were not wanted there. And I have never felt that at the gorge. Last year, I had a very strange experience in a national forest out in California. I was by myself on a road trip with my dog, and I was driving pretty far into Mendocino National Forest. I like to camp in national parks and forests because they're isolated so my dog can roam and they're free of charge. A trade-off for sketchy or rough drives into the park sometimes and a lack of service or assistance. Anyway, I was driving up this dirt road, kind of curling up a mountain. Around maybe 5 p.m. it was very nice out, sunny and warm with a slight breeze. Nothing serious happened, but I felt extremely uncomfortable driving into the area, and that feeling did not let up. Driving up the mountain, I felt like I shouldn't stay there, and I even texted my boyfriend about it for as long as I could before my phone completely lost service. I was looking for a sign of another person having been around the area lately, but I didn't see anything. I pulled over and got out of my car with my dog to look over the edge and noticed a dead squirrel and some broken glass mixed in with the dirt and gravel road. Yuka, my dog, starts to growl slightly. She is vocal, but I've almost only ever seen or heard her growl at or with other dogs. I did see her growl at a possum once, so it could be something she smelled. This place continued to make me feel quite on edge, but I pride myself on being an independent traveler and backpacker, so I decided to continue at least a bit further with my grumbling pup to see if I could find a good place to camp. I continue to notice more dead animals. Keep in mind that no one is going to be going more than 5 to 10 miles per hour up this thing, and that's if there's anyone even there. I hear men's voices. They sound close, and I think I should call out to them so I can stop my car, but then I kind of freeze up and feel like I shouldn't. I can't really make out what they're saying. I don't see any sign of people anywhere, and I get back in my car and continue to slowly drive forward, cautiously looking for where the voices could be coming from. I've never run into other people in a national park or forest when I've gone this deep. The unsettling feeling grows about the voices, which have sort of come and gone a few times, and I give up and begin to turn my car around. I honestly don't remember how Yuko was acting on the way down. I was scared and focused on getting out of there. I just distinctly remember being surprised at her grumbling when we were standing outside of my car. Kind of dangerously quickly, I went back down the mountain, not seeing any sign of anyone. I decided to spring for luxury and get a hotel for the night. I figured I was just fine. Huge and open spaces can be intimidating, I told myself, and the voices could have been echoing from somewhere far off, and they just sounded close. Animals die, glass gets broken, nothing happened, cool. But I remember this place, it sticks with me. Whenever I'm watching scary movies, if I'm walking my dog in the woods at night, nothing compares to the feeling I had driving up that mountain, and it's honestly kind of interesting to me as well as frightening. I recently came across some information, as well as some Native American lore, that made me feel extremely uneasy. Fast forward a year, I've mentioned this place to a few people and the haunting vibes it gave me, but nothing much more. Obviously, there's a ton of questionable information out there, but I tried to find more reputable websites and authentic experiences. I then specifically looked up missing persons in the area, and the first headline that catches my eye is another family goes missing in Mendocino, and I went through different websites and news articles of people going missing, but they are all a little hidden underneath national park websites and pictures of trees. I remembered looking up the forest about a year ago and didn't see anything, and I realized these stories didn't seem to be talked about much, which also piqued my intuition. It was stated that well over 100 people in the past 8 years have gone missing and not been found, on top of many who have been found dead. It just has my intuition super spiked. Remembering how unsafe I felt and how much I wanted to get out of there terrifies me, and I felt so uneasy about what I was hearing and doing to this day. My dog and I are very close. She was a stray that started following me one day, and I ended up bringing her home from Costa Rica, so her little growls along the way make me feel like there was something wrong. Even though it was just a storytelling video, those stories originate from somewhere. I have done a lot of solo traveling both in and out of the country, and I have never had such a bad feeling on top of seeing an unnecessary amount of dead animals in a national forest, which just seems strange. I don't think I'll be doing more solo travel unless it's around civilization. Does anyone know about authentic Native American lore, or has anyone else had a kind of inexplicable experience like this? I'm a backpacker. I grew up learning about nature and spending weeks in the remote backcountry of Canada as a young child. I am most comfortable in the mountains and deep, isolated woods. I've had many unsettling experiences but always attributed them to paranoia, until the past few experiences began to unnerve me to a different extent. There is a particular range located within the Canadian Rockies in southern British Columbia, Canada. Besides the range itself, the entire surrounding area just feels off. I was describing this experience to someone who lived out there. They happened to be a past Wiccan. They told me that people had told them in the past that the entire area feels dead and that it's lacking something. And that's truly the best way I can describe it. It doesn't feel as if there is danger, but I am absolutely positive that there is something wrong out there. On more than one occasion, I have spent a day or two hiking into the mountains of that range, only to become acutely aware that something isn't right. Back when I was 16, I was walking in a heavily wooded area near St. Louis, Missouri, a largely undeveloped plot of land that was known for a large population of deer. The snow and ice had been unusually heavy that winter, so as April came around, it continued to thaw and rain a lot. Very dreary, overcast day. There are lots of fallen trees and mud. I noticed one tree had fallen in the middle of the path and didn't focus too much on it until I saw something dangling inches from my face. It was a dead deer, a young buck, hanging from the fallen tree and between the two main branches. The hooves had been dangling inches from my face because of how zoned out I was, not processing anything because of the sense of security I felt in those woods. This was private property owned by the school I was attending, and hunting was strictly prohibited because there were neighborhoods nearby. More importantly, who walked hundreds of acres into the woods and hung the carcass up that way in the middle of a rainstorm. The school sent its security out. They figured it was illegal bow hunting. But the deer was never recovered, so at first they didn't believe my story until weeks later, when several female deer were found laying in a nearby open field. All sprawled out in bizarre poses, clearly manipulated after they died. There were no signs of postmortem cuts, scavenging from coyotes, or decay. Also too far away from the road to be roadkill, but could have been an attempt by someone to hide that they were hunting without license or permission. It's still very strange, and I haven't seen anything like it since. I live in Florida, where weird stuff happens all the time in the national parks and wetlands. I was crab hunting with my family, these being my father, my mother who stayed in the car, my brother, and myself. We went to a different spot than usual to hunt for crabs during the hunting season because we had heard a family member of ours once hauled over 12 crabs in a single session. The area was a tropical forest that was cordoned off with barbed wire and fencing, save for one little spot a person could sneak in at the risk of being barbed. We each had a flashlight, but I was stuck carrying the bucket since there was no way I could ever catch one with my bare hands. We began to spread out to cover more ground, and just as the three of us were all unable to see each other in a clear line of sight, night fell. I was by myself in the thick of the woods with nothing but my flashlight and my bucket. I ventured deeper into the woods until I came across a cement structure, overgrown with plants and clearly abandoned. I was getting some strong Blair Witch Project vibes but decided to venture further in. It seemed to be an abandoned restroom facility, made up of 3 rooms. 2 were lavatories, and the other was a shower area. I looked through each room, half expecting to find something horrible. Every time I crept my head around each corner, it was mostly just hollow rooms with only the very outline of what should have been visible. At least until I made it to the 3rd room. The 3rd room was just like the 2nd, a bathroom stall, except this one actually had a stone seat rather than a stone slab like the other had. When I stepped into that room, my nose was assaulted with this horrible smell. A smell so putrid and disgusting that I buried my nose into my sleeve with no avail to stuffing the rancid stench. The whole room was centered around this stone toilet, and I was curious if it was just full of shit and that was what I was smelling. When I looked down the toilet, I saw straight down a hole into another cement room, an entire 2nd floor buried under the ground. It wasn't just a poop chute where it was planned to accumulate the refuse over the years, but an entire separate floor buried underground. I hadn't seen any other way down when I approached the structure, and I'm still not sure how one was supposed to get down there and then back out, but I was not going to go find out. Inside, at the bottom of the toilet hole, there were mounds of this black material, and the smell immediately got stronger when I looked in. Then I heard footsteps. My heart immediately sank as I felt fear clutch my entire body and turned around, wondering if someone had found me or was approaching. I couldn't see far into the brush, but the footsteps didn't stop. Each crackle of twigs made me panic in silent fear more and more, and I debated if I should run or just suddenly scream for my family to come find me. Then the sound stopped. I kept the torch shining at the exit, my only exit, carefully listening for any sounds. When nothing else sounded, I slowly made my way out of the building. Clear of the structure and back on dirt, I immediately just bolted back until I found my brother, who was anxiously trying to catch a crab he had under his foot. I told him what I saw, and he just shrugged it off as being just an abandoned structure, which wasn't uncommon for this part of the island. I calmed down a bit, and I stuck with him for the rest of the trip. Finally back home and in bed, a single question kept me up for the better part of the night. Why was the toilet made of stone, in the center of the room, and without any apparent sign of plumbing or tubes going into it? And what was that room underground?